Welcome to the fourth and final lecture in this week where we talk about colonial Christianity globally. And it is the culminating lecture of an unfamiliar and at times complicated narrative. So I appreciate your patience through these lectures. In this lecture we're going to tackle 17th and 18th century Protestant missions in Asia specifically. And as a result of this lecture, the student will be able to describe why Protestant missionary efforts moved eastward. The student will explore how Protestant missions were pursued in Asia. And the student will evaluate the relationship between Protestant missions and colonialism. And let's begin by discussing the major vehicle of Protestant missions in Asia. It wasn't the imperial vehicle, at least not at first. It was the commercial vehicle. It was the establishment of the Dutch East India Company. And there was little European control, imperially, of any colonies in Asia. There was no attempts by Protestant nations to establish settler colonies in Asia like they did in North America. And this was before Protestantism really gained territorial empires, right? Portuguese had established a series of footholds in Hormuz, Goa, Malacca, and Macau. And in each of these cases, the Portuguese established trading posts, imperial trading posts on the coast. They didn't look for a land-based empire like the Spanish. Persia, India, and China allowed this because they weren't interested in territory but trade. Portuguese were not taking their territory. It was just another trading partner. So the main rivals for dominance in the intra-Asian trade was actually not Asians but other European countries. Trading companies were an alternative to the traditional imperial infrastructure. And the most powerful and important company of this period was the Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602. Traders struggled with the Spanish-Portuguese Empire, who repeatedly tried to conquer England. We can remember with Elizabeth I, King Henry VIII before, there's always this tension between the Spanish and the English. The gold from the Americas and spice from India funded these traders in the Dutch East India Company. And these companies maintained an independence from the government because they were never just companies, they were weapons of war in the sense that they were waging war on Catholic Europe through commerce. The year 1603, the year after the foundation of the Dutch East India Company, we have this quote from Jacob van Heemskerk. "May God's glory be exalted among so many different nations, peoples, and countries by means of the true Protestant religion. Perhaps the Lord will use a small, despised country and nation to work his mighty miracles." This is the foundation of what we know as the Protestant interest. This rivalry between what the Protestants thought the Catholic anti-Christian kingdoms of the world. Protestants couldn't go toe-to-toe with militaries against them at this point, so they tried to outtrade them, to weaken their economy, to give their militaries an advantage. 1622, the Dutch East India Company renewed their charter. And in this renewed charter, they included the preservation of the public Reformed faith as part of their mission. So we see the Dutch East India Company moving into India. And it was through India that they traded for the spices of Indonesia. And they adopted treaties where attempts to win converts were actually forbidden. Where the Dutch East India Company, despite this commitment to the Protestant interest, did not allow the friction caused by missionaries to interfere with the commercial venture. So we see this tension between commerce as part of the Protestant interest and it resulting in the restriction of evangelism. The Dutch in Japan engaged in a campaign to suppress Catholicism, right? the Dutch established a trading post in Nagasaki and agreed there also to not engage in a hint of evangelism to Protestant Christianity. Dutch ships were required to seal their Bibles in caskets while in port. There was a Swedish Lutheran soldier. This is from a Swedish Lutheran soldier, that Dutch traders were not allowed to mention the name of Christ on pain of death in Japan, to read prayers. They were forbidden to change clothes on Sunday so that no one would appear to be Christian. Right? Eventually, the Dutch were able to move their trading posts into Indonesia proper, in Ambon. And in Ambon, they expelled the Portuguese. They got the Catholics out of there. And the Dutch were able to monopolize the clothes production. Catholics, when they came in, exercised mass baptisms without any instruction. So the commitment to Catholic Christianity was very shallow. The Dutch sought to encourage cooperation through trade and established institutions of education. They suppressed Catholicism and Islam. They burned mosques. They forced people to eat pork. In other words, the Dutch East India Company proper tried to civilize them so that they can be converted. A Protestant minister actually did not arrive in Indonesia until 1615. Here he did set up schools, he learned Malay, but he still had this basic disdain for local people. Let me read a quote reflecting the opinion of the Indonesian Christians. These people, So this is a Dutch minister talking about local Catholic Christians. These people call themselves Christians but still seek secretly the devil. While they think that they affirm their confession by eating pork, many of them indeed come to church on Sunday, but this is more a matter of compulsion than of conviction, because they will be fined $0.25 of a real if they do not come. So we can see Catholic coercive measurements, and coupled with a lack of training, it's no surprise that Protestants were able to move into the area. This practice of paying people to be Christian in rice gave rise to the use of the term rice Christian, that people would come to church in order to get a handout. And eventually, Protestant Christianity moved into the countryside beyond the town of Ambon. In 1633, there were 32 schools operating with 1,200 pupils. 50 years later, there were 46 schools with 3,500 pupils. And even though the Dutch came in with a more persuasive brand of Christianity than the Catholics did, it was still a commercial venture, and they did resort to using violence and deportation. There were mass executions on the island of Banda, and they explicitly tried to build a great culture in Indonesia in order to arouse the jealousies of the pagans. So in 1619, Batavia, which we know as Jakarta today, became the capital of the Dutch East India Company. It had a population of about 32,000. 50% of the population of Batavia, 16,000, were slaves, which were mainly indentured servants in households. A symbol of wealth in the society was the freeing of one's slaves. So there arose a category, a class of people in Indonesia known as the Mardikers. The 5,000 free people. 5,000 of these 32,000 were freed slaves. Many were still Catholic, but Protestantism began to grow. And this became a problem when you compare Catholic standards for membership with the Dutch Reformed Church standards of membership. As we began this whole series of lectures highlighting, is that Catholic conversion is easy. You get baptized. Protestant conversion is a matter of the heart. So one had to go through a number of hoops to prove that there was a change in one's heart. And that did slow the population of Christians. Even in the Netherlands, less than 20% of the population was a member of their church. So for every member of a Dutch Reformed church, there were 2 to 3 members who were adherents to the Reformed faith, but not members of the church. So in Batavia in 1674, there were about 2,300 members. In 1700, about 5,000 members, but it was not growing at the same rate that Catholic missions did. So they created a new office as they sought to train people beyond the cities, a lay catechist. And these lay catechists were Asians. They were Mardikers. They were freed Asians who would report to the ordained ministers. It's interesting how this somewhat reflects the expansion of Methodism through circuit riders into the interior of America. These Mardikers went house to house giving instructions, something the Catholic Church didn't do, and then reporting back to the ministers to get some directions. The Dutch had moved into Sri Lanka, into Ceylon. And we see in Sri Lanka as well that this establishment of Protestantism was slow. Much slower than Catholicism that just dunked a bunch of people and called them Christian, right? They established schools and churches. By the 18th century, the printing press produced books in native languages and could be disseminated cheaply and quickly. Seminaries were founded for the training of people, for the administration of people, for the ministry. When the British seized Sri Lanka after the Napoleonic Wars, they counted the Protestant population as about 1/5 of the population, just shy of 250,000 people. So while it took a long time for this internal sense of the heart to catch on in Sri Lanka and to train ministers, it seems like it took deep root. This is an example of what Protestants could do if they had enough time to do it. So in addition to the Protestant Dutch, we have the Protestant Danish mission. And we see a great example of that in India. In 1712, George Lewis was a Welsh chaplain working in Chennai. And his mission was to provide services to these Protestants that came over with the commercial ventures to minister to the Europeans and their children, the expats there. But in October of 1712, Lewis got excited because he heard of this Danish East Indian Company settlement in Tranquebar. And an independent mission, not an imperial, not a commercial mission, but an independent mission that was established there to work with the Tamil people. And Lewis was so impressed, he wrote to the Society for the Propagation of Knowledge, the missionaries at Tranquebar ought and must be encouraged. It is the first attempt the Protestants have made in that kind. We must not put out the smoking flax. It would give our adversaries, the papists, who boast so much of their congregation de propaganda fide, too much cause to triumph over us. So Lewis saw this cross-Protestant nation cooperation as a way to oppose the spread of Catholicism in the world. He wasn't exactly correct in saying that this was the first Protestant mission of its kind, but it was the first collaborative Protestant mission of its kind. And this Tranquebar mission was different for two reasons. First, its structure. It was based out of the Danish East India Company, but it was not a project of the Danish East India Company. It was an independent mission that used Danish infrastructure in order to support an independent mission. And we know it was independent because at various times and places, the Danish missionaries worked at cross purposes with the commercial venture and were imprisoned, right? And whenever a missionary was imprisoned by the commercial venture, it only bolstered their reputation with the locals they were trying to serve, right? It's interesting that King Frederick IV of Denmark supported this mission. So it was a mission that took advantage of commercial infrastructure, had imperial backing, but yet was independent. And it had captured the attention of August Hermann Francke in Halle. It captured the attention of the English Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge, who decided to just send them books. They even sent Tranquebar a printing press that was captured and ransomed in Brazil. It eventually did make it to Tranquebar and printed the first New Testament in Tamil. This mission had an interesting structure with imperial support, commercial infrastructure, yet was independent. It was a collaborative effort between Danish and Dutch and British people, and George Lewis, the Welsh chaplain, was so impressed that when he returned to Britain, he tried to replicate this approach to missions because he saw the Protestant interest in this cosmic struggle with Catholicism. Second aspect that caused this mission to stand out was its people. Specifically, and I give apologies to this person, Bartholomeus Ziegenbalg. He lived 1682 to 1719. While most European missionaries, imperial, commercial, and otherwise, thought that you had to civilize a people before they could be converted, Ziegenbalg learned Tamil, he collected local books, he studied Tamil culture, and he saw the value in Tamil culture and embraced it. Ziegenbalg realized what Yajiro realizes: the greatest obstacle to Christian missions in Asia were Christians. Sailors getting off the boat, even missionaries that came in and disrespected local values. And he decided to do it differently, and his progress was slow. The Danish mission progress was slow. They baptized only 250 people. And we can have a debate whether or not that's a lot or a little, but it did establish a deep-rooted, long-term mission in India. Let's talk a little bit about early British missionary efforts. The British efforts in India and Africa took a little bit different of approach. Following the lead of a German missionary, Peter Heiling, early British missionaries sought to reinvigorate ancient Christian churches in Muslim lands. So they were not establishing Anglican churches so much as they were trying to reform ancient Asian and African churches. In 1592, they formed the English Levant Company during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. It was the merging of the Venice Company with the Turkey Company. So we can even see the initial British efforts were in a different area than the Dutch and the Danish. And the British established significant trading outposts in Aleppo in Syria. And English chaplains would go in with these commercial ventures and establish contacts in the Oriental Orthodox Church. And they saw these chaplains as an opportunity to reform ancient Asian churches. But maybe the most significant way, maybe not the most effective way, but the most significant way that the British tried to promote Protestantism was through the printing and distribution of books. And we've already talked about Robert Boyle paying for an Irish translation of the Bible. Boyle was not only a scientist responsible for Boyle's Law, he was a missionary enthusiast. Robert Boyle lived 1627 to 1691, well before William Carey. In 1660, he funded an Arabic translation of Hugo Grotius's On the Truth of the Christian Religion. He funded a Turkish edition of the New Testament, an Arabic edition of the Book of Common Prayer. And none of these printing projects had any observable impact, unfortunately. If Catholics thought that baptism had its own intrinsic saving power, and this is Alec Ryrie's opinion, Protestants thought books had an intrinsic saving power. They knew that God's word was alive and active, and if you scattered it, it would take root. So in 1720, the Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge published an Arabic New Testament in Psalter with the Orthodox Patriarch in Antioch. So again, working with ancient Christian churches there. And the SPCK seizes on this opportunity, but they didn't really have a plan to distribute it. They didn't have a what's next after it was distributed. They raised 2,400 pounds to print 8,000 copies. By 1737, 6,000 Arabic Psalters were printed, 10,000 Arabic New Testaments, 5,000 Arabic catechisms, all for about 3,000 pounds. The problem is no one wanted them. And 50 years later, more than half the copies were left in the SPCK's warehouse in London and never even got to the places to be distributed. So the British early efforts, well-intentioned, not very well thought out. So let me conclude our time together with a couple of examples that allow us to examine the relationship between Protestantism and colonialism. Is the story of missions, Protestant missions in the 17th and 18th century, a story about religion or politics? And how did those two relate to each other, specifically in Protestantism? We've seen that imperial and commercial projects globally in the 17th and 18th century did include religious motives. The commercial projects thought that religion would pacify and civilize people, so to make it easier to trade with them. And ministers and missionaries were willing to work within the infrastructure of these commercial and imperial ventures. But this alliance of convenience only went so far, because we do see instances where missionary efforts frustrate commercial efforts. So there was a genuine agency of Protestant missions in the 17th and 18th century. Let me tell the story of Ireland and William Beadle. Ireland had been under English rule since the 12th century, but after the English Reformation, England had to intervene